Good morning. Today is kind of a part two from something I talked about last week. At 11 o'clock in our service last week, I talked about the Israel and Hamas conflict that's ongoing and what is the Christian supposed to think about that. And it was really a very wide-ranging discussion. It was almost like 3 or 4 different sub-sermons all within one 30-minute sermon. And there was one element of that just really, I couldn't do justice in the time allotted and within the framework of that lesson. And so I want to go back to that and make kind of a part two and expound upon it a little bit more. I want to talk about this idea of premillennialism. Premillennialism is a long word, kind of hard to say, fumble around a little bit as you say it, but I'll explain it here in just a moment. It is something that we encounter frequently. Maybe you don't always hear it called premillennialism. You may hear dispensationalism is another term that's thrown around for it. It's basically the idea of a 1,000-year literal earthly reign of Jesus Christ, that Jesus is going to come back after a period of rapture, and he's going to reign for 1,000 years, essentially in Jerusalem on a literal throne as king of the world. And we all get to enjoy that 1,000-year reign with him. At the end of that 1,000-year reign, Satan is going to escape from his prison cell, cause a bunch of mischief, and there's going to be one last climactic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And then finally then, we get to go to our eternal home in heaven. All of this was very popularized, especially in the middle of the 20th century. A lot of books were written in that time. Tim LaHaye wrote a book series called Left Behind, and it dramatized these events so that you got to see kind of in individuals' lives, like what would happen if you just, you woke up and your wife was gone. She was just raptured all of a sudden. Or you're a pilot on an airplane. You're Nicolas Cage on an airplane, and your co-pilot just suddenly disappears along with all the babies and children on the airplane, and everyone's going, my baby, and all the good people got raptured and everybody else got left behind. Very famously, Hal Lindsey wrote a book in 1970 called The Late Great Planet Earth, where he goes through a series of Old Testament prophecies and shows how current events of the time, like the 1967 war in Israel and the rise of Russia and China, and how current events of that time period were all prophesied specifically in the Bible if you just knew the code language. And as long as you knew the code language, you could map out major events from the 20th century and see exactly when Jesus was going to be coming back. Maybe you've encountered the Jehovah's Witnesses in the community at some point. I was out running at one of the parks here in Collierville just a couple weeks ago, and the Jehovah's Witnesses had a little setup there with their literature and all the, their missionaries out with little name tags and everything. Or maybe Jehovah's Witnesses have come to your door sometime. They're also in that camp. In fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses' own website said that the reign of Christ began in 1914. So just so we're all clear, Jesus was not reigning until 1914. And now all of the major events of the 20th century have sort of led up to where we are now. Essentially, premillennialism, and this is the simplified chart. Okay, this is the simplified chart. I'll show you the not simplified chart in just a moment, but just for simplicity's sake, you have the first coming of Jesus Christ over at the left hand of the screen. Jesus came, he had his ministry, he died on the cross, and from that point forward, we lived in the church age. The church age was a time where the gospel was being spread. People are hearing about Jesus. Some are listening and some are rejecting. At some point, though, a rapture is going to happen where all of God's people are going to be scooped up and everyone else will be left behind, and there will be 7 years of tribulation here in the world. Chaos and economic and political disruption and conflict, and some people are going to overcome, and they're going to survive that 7-year tribulation, and they'll be all the better for it because they basically took their second chance, and ran with it. And now they're believers, wholehearted believers, at which point you're going to have the Battle of Armageddon. Satan's going to be bound in some celestial prison cell, and we'll have 1,000 years of peaceful Jesus reign. Jesus will be here on earth. It'll be a paradise-like existence on earth where everyone's going to get along well with each other. Dogs and cats are going to be snuggling up with each other. 1,000-year peaceful reign of Christ. But Satan will escape. He'll be loosed for a short time, and he'll cause a bunch of mischief, and Jesus will finally defeat him, and then, and only then, the judgment day happens, and some go to heaven, some go to hell, and that is eternity. Now, this is the more complicated one that you probably see going around on the internet a lot. And when I looked at it, I thought, I've seen that before. I've seen that before when I was in New York last year. I think it's the Metro line. I'm telling you, it's uncanny. It is absolutely uncanny the way that it's like, it's the Metro line in New York. All right, okay. That's not fair to pick on people, but let's go to Matthew chapter 24, because there's a lot of different elements of premillennialism that you could look at, and I know that this is, ironically enough, for being a part 2 where I want to focus on premillennialism, we actually have to bring the scope even a little closer, because you can only look at one element of premillennialism at a time because it is such a big subject. So if you were going to spend, your half an hour type lesson kind of going over like what's the most important thing I've got to have in my back pocket? Well, obviously understanding the book of Revelation, but we can't do that in a half an hour. So we can tackle Matthew 24. Probably next to the book of Revelation itself, chapter 19, 20, 21. Matthew chapter 24 is one of those passages that you really need to have that one in your toolbox ready to go. You got to understand what it's talking about, because it is a place that at face value, Matthew chapter 24 certainly has a lot of drama in it, and certainly comes across at face value as as being what they claim to be as far as premillennialism goes. The idea of tribulation and a rapture and being taken up and left behind, and it really fits that dramatic narrative. But I think within the context of Matthew and the Bible as a whole, I really don't think that you can promote premillennialism from this chapter. So, Matthew chapter 24, go and have your Bible there. Put a bookmarker in there. That's obviously where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Let's start with the timetable, okay? Start with the timetable. So, everything that you're going to read here in Matthew chapter 24 is already given a timestamp. You're already given a timestamp in verse 34. And it says in verse 34, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place." So at minimum, at the very least, everything up to the point of verse 34 had to have happened in the first century to people who were living contemporary with Jesus. Now, I get that there's an argument that one can make that after verse 34, you go, well, maybe that's judgment day, maybe that's heaven and hell. I'm still not sure that we're at the point of heaven and hell and the judgment day after verse 34. But listen, for the sake of argument, at the very least, everything leading up to verse 34 has to occur during the lifetime of people living in the contemporary with Jesus. So I think that timestamp is really, really important. And anybody who says otherwise, to deal with a lot of things in this chapter, you have to jump through a lot of hoops and bend over really, really far backwards like an Olympic gold medalist gymnast to make some of the stuff in this chapter fit the timeline of, well, no, he's clearly talking about stuff that's happening in the 20th century or even the 21st century. Like, I don't know. It's really, really difficult to make some of the stuff in Matthew 24 happen 2,000 years after Jesus said it. So I think verse 34 is really, really important. Not only that, but the whole context of Matthew 24, including chapter 23, seems to indicate, I mean, at every step of the way, that what we're talking about is not the rapture and the tribulation and the judgment day over the whole world. What we're talking about is a specific judgment against a specific place in a pretty specific time. And that judgment is against Jerusalem in the first century. It's against Jerusalem in the first century. You go back to chapter 23 even, and before we read another word here, go to Matthew chapter 23 and realize in verse 37, this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is looking out over the city of Jerusalem. And he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And Jerusalem is frequently in Old Testament literature, Jerusalem is frequently used as a stand-in for the people in general. I mean, oftentimes in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, you'll see Jerusalem, you'll see Jacob, you'll see Israel, you'll see Judah. I mean, you'll see these words kind of used interchangeably of God's people, of God's people. In the same way that we might say that America is not just a physical place, but that America is also a political entity, and that America is also the citizens. But you could also say America is also the spirit of our country. And so the word America can mean a lot of different things. We might also refer to America by a lot of different things. Our country, 'tis of thee. The United States of America. The United States. America. USA. Whatever it is. And so Jerusalem, Jerusalem, he's not talking about just the city, though the city is included in that. He's talking about the people as well. And historically, because Jerusalem, Jerusalem killed the prophets. Going all the way back to prophets from 400, 500, 600 years earlier. So we're clearly talking about Jerusalem. But then we pick up here at the beginning of Matthew 24, and let's see what the context has to say. Are we talking about a rapture and tribulation and Armageddon? Are we talking about a worldwide cataclysmic event here? Let's look at some of the questions that are asked by Jesus' own disciples. Jesus came out from the temple in verse 1 and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered essentially that they're in Jerusalem, and they don't go to Jerusalem very often. If you take John's gospel at face value, Jesus has been to Jerusalem basically once a year for a festival during his ministry. I don't know how many other times in his life he went to Jerusalem. He certainly went as a baby when he was dedicated, but how many times Jesus went to Jerusalem in his lifetime is unclear. But he doesn't go very often. And so here they are in Jerusalem, and they're kind of pointing out all the buildings. And, a few years ago, Herod added this thing over here, and this was added, and that part's not quite done yet. They worked on the temple in Jerusalem for decades. And they didn't even finish the temple until a few years before it was destroyed in 70 A.D. That's kind of a downer, isn't it? You work on a temple for like 75 years or something like that, and you finally get it finished, and the Romans come and burn it to the ground. But so they're pointing out the temple buildings, and Jesus said in verse 2, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another which will not be torn down." What's he talking about there? Is he talking about cities the world over? Is he talking about governments on the other side of the planet? Is he talking about buildings in Jerusalem? Do you see this? He's talking about buildings in Jerusalem. So his disciples in verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Oh, we're talking about the end of the world, right? Not quite. By the end of the age, it makes a lot more sense in the context that the end of the age is the end of a religious age or a covenantal age. And we know from other passages in the New Testament, like the entire book of Hebrews, for example, Hebrews chapter 9, Hebrews chapter 10, that the reason why Jesus came was to bring about a new covenantal age, to bring about a new covenant. As he says at the dedication of the Lord's Supper, this blood is the blood of my covenant. Hebrews 9 says new covenants are inaugurated with blood. Hebrews chapter 8 says the old covenant is obsolete and disappearing and is being replaced now by the predicted covenant from Jeremiah 31. That I'll make a new covenant with the people of Israel. And so the disciples aren't asking about the end of the world. They're asking about the end of so here's the temple. Look, the temple and the priests, there's smoke rising from altars. There are animals being sacrificed. This is the whole milieu of the old covenant. And they're saying, this temple, this priesthood, those sacrifices, when is the end of this going to happen? Because you seem to be, as a prophet, as a Messiah, you seem to be indicating that there's going to be new things happening as a result of your ministry. So when is the end of this age happening? They're not asking about the end of the world. They're asking about the end of a covenantal period. And so he goes on and says in verse 4, see to it that no one misleads you. That's a really important key element of this. See to it that no one misleads you. Is it possible to be misled? Well, absolutely. And I said in a comment last week, we were talking about Tim LaHaye and Hal Lindsey and other people who are always predicting the end of the world and have big fancy charts and love to get people all scared because of war in the Middle East. And I said, just remember what Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy about false prophets versus real prophets. How do you know a real prophet versus a false prophet? Just wait long enough and you'll see. Just let things play out. Because the false prophet is always betrayed by reality. The false prophet is always betrayed by the news. Just let the news play out and you'll find out pretty quickly who the false prophets are. And it's amazing that people like Hal Lindsey haven't been more discredited, broadly speaking, by the religious world because of how many times their predictions have been debunked. It is amazing to me, and this is not an insult, by the way. It's not an insult at all. It is amazing to me that anybody still believes what Ellen G. White ever had to say. It is amazing to me that anybody is still a Jehovah's Witness. It is amazing to me that anybody would still subscribe to fear preaching based on false prophecies that have been debunked over and over and over again. You know, in America in particular, there has been a fervor for the last couple centuries over millennial thinking, over Zionist thinking. When the Civil War was ramping up, everybody said this is the sign of the end of the world. Clearly the end of the world is happening. And then the Civil War was done and the end of the world didn't happen. World War I, absolutely cataclysmic event to be sure. All of Western Europe was ruined because this is the end of the world, they said. And then it wasn't the end of the world. And then we started building atomic bombs and threatening each other with atomic. This is the end of the world, they said. And then it still wasn't the end of the world. At some point, you have to listen to Jesus who said, don't let people mislead you. Stop letting people trick you. Stop falling for just the latest scare tactics. Stop letting people mislead you. For he says in verse 5, for many will come in my name saying, well, I am the Christ, and they'll mislead many. And you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. That's exactly what life has been like for 2,000 years now, right? Wars and rumors of wars. For 2,000 straight years, wars and rumors of wars. And you're also going to see that you ought not to be frightened by those things because they must take place. And that's not the end. I like how Jesus is very clear. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, that's not the end of the world. In fact, in a way, and it feels weird saying this, but in a way, the existence of war on planet Earth is actually a reassurance that things are just kind of going on normally. I'll tell you what, the day that there's no war, that's the day I would probably be worried. But essentially he's saying when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, and he goes on in the next verse and says that kingdoms will rise against other kingdoms. In various places there'll be famines and earthquakes in verse 7. He's essentially saying that when there's war and famine and earthquake, these are not signs of the times. Actually, that's just the world operating normally. At least normal insofar as a world can operate when it's been corrupted by sin. Don't let war and famine and earthquake cause you to panic, because that's just stuff that happens in this world. It always has, and it always will. And that's just part of what life is like on a corrupted world. So watch out for people who are always promoting false signs. He says in verse 11, and many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. All right. So specifically, if we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem here, what are some things in the text that seem to indicate the way this is going to play out? And that's the next section here in verses 15 through 28. I know it's a little bit longer here, but let's go ahead and read the whole thing. Bear with me as I read the whole thing. I'll try to keep it dramatic to keep your attention. I'll tell you what, if you don't think Matthew 24 is a dramatic passage, I'm not sure what in the Bible could get the juices going. He says in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, go and put that one in your back pocket, okay? Put that in your back pocket, because that phrase is really, really important. And it appears in another place in the Old Testament, and Luke actually gives a straight answer about what we're talking about there. So, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. And I love Matthew. Matthew puts this parenthetically in like, don't go nuts. Don't worry. Don't have anxiety. Just slow down. Pump the gas, the brake pedal, and just try to understand what I'm saying. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to get the things that are in his house. Let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. If therefore they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go forth. Or, behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there will the vultures gather. All right. What is the abomination of desolation? Well, conveniently enough, Luke actually explains to us exactly what the abomination of desolation is. So if you think the abomination of desolation, and these are some theories, perhaps the abomination of desolation is a one world government that comes in, that is led by the Antichrist. And the Antichrist is some slick, good-looking guy in a suit, like Justin Trudeau or something like that. I'm not saying Justin Trudeau is the Antichrist, by the way. But that's one theory, that it's some one world government led by the Antichrist. Okay, maybe that's the abomination of desolation. Or some kind of war, or some kind of conflict, or some kind of great cataclysmic event. Well, Luke actually says in Luke chapter 21 and verses 20 and 21, and this is the parallel. This is the Olivet Discourse in Luke's gospel, okay? This is the same scene, same situation. Luke is writing the exact same speech that Jesus does, but Luke offers this interpretive kind of take on it. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So Matthew says, when you see the abomination of desolation, and you go, oh, that's a weird phrase. The abomination of desolation. What could that be? Well, that's got to be something. Luke says, the abomination of desolation is when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Oh, okay, well, I guess that makes sense. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a one-world government? Are we talking about World War III? Are we talking about the Antichrist? Or are we talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD? Luke is very clear about this. The abomination of desolation is the destruction of Jerusalem. And when you see the Roman army coming around the bend, coming over the rise, when you see the dust from the Roman army coming to Jerusalem, get out of town. And there were a lot of people in Jerusalem who didn't. There were holdouts during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And they held out till they were starving and desperate. They held out until the last little pocket of resistance was in the temple itself. And the Romans burned the city to the ground, and everybody in it was killed. And so Jesus is saying, do not be so attached to Jerusalem that when you see Rome coming, that you can't get out of Dodge. Listen, that's what the Olivet Discourse is about. You want to know the point of Matthew chapter 24? It's not complicated. It's not prophecies that require a giant chart with different arrows all over it of, oh, this is this, and it's World War III, and then it's Russia over here, and then... That's not what Matthew 24 is about. Matthew 24 is Jesus looking at Jerusalem saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I have reached out to you for so many centuries now. I have loved you, and I have sent you prophets, and I have given you grace and mercy and chance after chance to do what is right. And I'm begging you one last time, Jerusalem, that when you see Rome coming, that's it. That's it. It's the last chance. And I'm not giving you any chances after that. And the temple's going to be destroyed and it will never be rebuilt. And it's been 2,000 years. Has there been a temple in Jerusalem? Nope. And your priesthood is destroyed. Has there been a priesthood in Jerusalem? Nope. And the sacrificial system is destroyed. Has there been sacrifices in Jerusalem? Nope. That's it. 70 AD was it. And Matthew 24 is Jesus' last desperate act of love and mercy to a city that he has loved for centuries. And only those who are willing to listen to Jesus and to not be misled by false prophets and charlatans and the chief priests and the Pharisees, only people who will leave behind the old system and the old covenant and who are willing to be on the side of Jesus will survive this destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Matthew 24 is about. It's not talking, and listen, there's some things about this that just absolutely do not fit the text. If we're talking about the rapture here, right? This is some kind of rapture, or this is the 7 years of tribulation. Why in the world are there nursing babies? Like, that's the part, like, I don't get it. I don't get how the premillennialists can say, well, the rapture is going to happen, and like babies and children and innocent people and Christians and saints are going to be scooped up and taken away, and then there will be this rapture. Well, wait, Jesus says that this this tribulation is going to include children and nursing babies. What in the world are they doing there in the tribulation? What are they doing in the tribulation? I thought babies and children would get scooped up in the rapture and they don't have to go through the tribulation. And he says, I cut short that time for the sake of the elect. Wait a minute. I thought the elect got taken away in the rapture. Again, what are the elect doing in the tribulation? Because I thought the elect got scooped up and taken away along with all the babies. So how come there are babies and the elect and nursing mothers who are enduring this tribulation when the whole premillennialist mindset says that babies and children and the elect don't have to go through the tribulation. It just doesn't fit at all. He uses a phrase here, lightning flashing from the east and toward the west, he says there in verse 27. That's a really cool phrase, by the way. And I think what it's indicating is that God's judgment against specific nations is quick. And it comes, it swoops in, and it does what it's going to do, and it is always effective. God's judgment doesn't come upon people, like a tortoise at the zoo. God's judgment doesn't come upon people in a way that's like just kind of blunted and ineffective. It's like lightning that flashes from one side of the sky to the other side of the sky. And by the way, that is language that is used in the Old Testament of specific judgments against nations. And so if you think that all of this language has to be, the end of the world language, it's not. Let me give you a good example here. And let me reiterate what my point is here in bringing up Isaiah 13. If anybody reads Matthew 24 and says, well, this is clearly end of the world type stuff. I mean, we're talking about destruction and tribulation and all this trouble and lightning flashing and the sun being darkened, and that's clearly the end of the world stuff. But actually, that's the exact same kind of language that God frequently uses in the Old Testament of specific judgments against you and you and you, against specific nations, like in Isaiah chapter 13. In Isaiah chapter 13, the first verse says this is an oracle concerning Babylon, okay? Specific to Babylon. And if that's not specific enough, look at verse 17 of Isaiah 13. Behold, I am going to stir up the Medes against them. All right, so we're not talking, this is not symbolic here. It's not symbolic Babylon. This is not code language. He's very specific. Babylon, I'm going to stir up the Medes against you. So Isaiah 13 is about the destruction of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians, okay? The Medo-Persian Empire that rises up from within Babylon itself and takes over the empire. Again, this is not code language. This is not some kind of like apocalyptic mystery. No, it's a specific judgment against a specific nation in a specific time that history shows was fulfilled. But look at the language that he uses in verse 9. Start here in verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. Are we talking about the end of the world? The judgment day? No. The day of the Lord is a day of judgment against Babylon. So the day of the Lord is a phrase that can be used in a lot of different contexts. It can be used of specific judgments against specific people. The day of the Lord is not the end of the world. The day of the Lord is his judgment against you, Babylon. And the day of the Lord is coming cruel with fury and burning anger to make the land a desolation. He'll exterminate sinners from it, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. Are we talking like literally the moon and the sun not giving their light? Well, no. Your world is going to be turned upside down is basically what he's saying. Babylon, your whole world's going to be turned upside down. A people who were subservient to you, the Medes and the Persians, they're going to be your masters. In your safety, in your great cities, your cities are going to be destroyed and laid waste, and the gates will be opened up to conquerors from within your own empire. Your whole world's going to be turned upside down. That's the language that he's using here. And he goes on and talks a lot about other things here as well, about the whole world being turned upside down, your whole life being turned and changed. And so I think it's just clear here to see that when God uses the phrase the day of the Lord and uses this cataclysmic thing like the sun being darkened, he's not always literally talking about the sun being darkened or this is the end of the world. Sometimes it's very specific to certain nations. One last phrase before we move on here, and we'll bring the lesson to a close. Really interesting phrase here where he talks about in Matthew chapter 24 about the vulture in verse 28, that wherever the corpse is, there the vulture will gather. That's a really interesting phrase. Essentially, wherever a dead body is, what are you gonna find there as well? The vultures, right? Leave a dead body long enough and you're going to have vultures picking at it. It's inevitable. And that's what he's saying here about Jerusalem. There's an inevitability. Try to say that 3 times fast. It's an inevitability that God's judgment is coming. And just as surely as you find vultures by the dead body, so God's judgment is coming with this prophecy. And history bore that out. Oh, Jerusalem, 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 Jerusalem. What a city Jerusalem was, and what judgment was brought upon it. Jerusalem was a place where you had David and Solomon communing with God. You had priests for generations performing holy duties and sacrifices. You had people coming together for festivals to honor great things that God had done for them in their history. Reminders from generation to generation, year to year, season to season of all the good that God had done in bringing forth fruits from the earth and the harvest in its due season, and rescuing his people from their trials and tribulations. It was the city where Hezekiah laid out a letter before the altar of God and said, God, I can't handle this myself. I need you. And God was there for him. It was the city. It was the city where great prophets stood before kings, wicked, evil kings, and said what needed to be said and dealt with the consequences even in their own body. It was the city where Nehemiah came back and brought some dignity by rebuilding walls, where Ezra came back and brought even more dignity by reading the law to the people. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, where Jesus performed many miracles, signs, and wonders. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, where Jesus turned over the tables of money changers to remind them that that was not a place of business, but a place of holiness. And if only Jerusalem, Jerusalem had turned to Jesus Christ when they had their chance, things would not have turned out the way they did for Jerusalem, Jerusalem. That's what Matthew chapter 24 is really all about. Her tribulation came upon her, not because of God's indignity or because of God's lack of love or because God forgot all about Jerusalem. It was brought upon them because of the sins of the ages that they participated in themselves. It needed to happen also, because I think as long as that temple was there, there were always going to be people who maybe had one foot in the door of that temple. I'll tell you what, nothing made a cleaver in history like the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Nothing was so clear to all of mankind where God's love and affection was when the love and affection was not on Jerusalem any longer. And so you had a very clear choice to make. Live with the ruins of a covenant long past, of a temple destroyed, of sacrifices that did nothing for you, or join Jesus, like Hebrews 13 says, outside the city, outside the camp. Let's go ahead and bring our lesson to a close with a word of prayer.